Hi, I'd like to talk again about Romans 5 and James 1. I'm going to be doing that for a few weeks. What both these say are that God uses trials to make us more like Jesus. So my main point today is going to be on the word various in James 1, but let me make a couple points sort of in a review before that. So the idea is that God uses trials to make us more like Christ. I want to point out that doesn't just mean that we act more like Christ. It means he's really transforming the way we are. He's really changing our character to make us different people so that it's part of our default response. Romans 5 actually calls that proven character. It says tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proven character. James 1 uses a longer phrase, but it's the same idea. It says, the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So the idea is that we are sort of unformed yet, and we need to be well-rounded. We need to be filled out as people and become like Christ in the way that we are meant to be. And that completes us or makes us perfect in the sense of being complete, of having nothing really missing in who we're supposed to be. So God crafts the things that happen in our lives to help teach us to become like Christ. How do you get from the trial to the proven character? Well, there's two things that I'm just going to say for now. We're going to go into a lot more detail on these in future weeks, but I just want to establish them now for what I am going to talk about. The first thing is a trial will always push you to choose between a Christ-like response and a not so Christ-like response. The Christ-like response might be an action, it might be a thought, it might be an attitude, but a trial will push you to choose between a Christ-like response and a not so Christ-like response. And the second thing is found in James 1, where it says the testing of your faith produces endurance. A trial will always push you to have to trust God in order to be able to make that Christ-like response. So in every trial, you're going to be pushed to trust God in order to choose to respond as Christ would. And as you do that, what this is saying is that not only do you maybe then make that choice to respond as Christ would, but God begins to build it into the character of who you are. He begins to use it to complete you and make you more like Christ. And that's the exciting thing. And that's the reason we can have joy in it. All right, I want to focus for today on just one single idea, one single word. And it's the word in James 1, where he says, count it all joy when you encounter various trials. He didn't have to put that word in there. He could have just said, count it all joy when you encounter trials. But he says various trials to make it clear that there's a lot of different kinds of trials, and they all count. And your trials might be very different than mine, but they still count. This verse still works for you, just as it does for me, or just as it does for any of us. So the word various has to do with the fact of the diversity of the trials we face. They're all very different. And so I just want to sort of flesh that out a little bit by walking around the different kinds of trials that we face and reminding you or encouraging you that every one of these is a trial that in fact counts as something that can make us more like Christ. It counts as something that will push us to trust God to make a Christ-like response. First of all, they can be either little trials or big trials. So big trials, in one sense, are obvious, but in one sense, they're very difficult. Sometimes people, I've talked to people who they're like, well, I can handle little things, but what I suffered in my life, maybe serious childhood abuse growing up, or maybe the death of a spouse, or something that's really tragic for them. And they say, you can't really expect me to count it joy when I face those things, can you? Well, I'm not saying that those things themselves are joyful. But yes, we can believe that God will somehow use even things as serious and tragic as those to make us more like Christ. Um, uh, if anything, it gives you some understanding of what Jesus himself faced as he went to the cross, because he certainly went through something just as serious and tragic as any of us did. But that's the first thing. Big trials count. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that I would be able to do as well in your shoes. But I'm saying that if you are facing really big trials, this verse is still there for you. There's still an invitation for you to count it joy what God is doing through it and how he's making you more like Jesus. On the other end is little trials, just little inconveniences. I went to the store the other day to get Oreos, and they didn't have the kind I wanted. I wanted to get this new tiramisu Oreo, and they didn't have it, and I was annoyed. And you know what? Oddly, that counts as a trial. It seems too little to even, it seems silly to count it as anything, but did it test my faith and push me to choose to respond in a Christ-like way? Yes, it did. So even in a tiny little thing like that, little inconveniences, not finding the parking spot you wanted, or stubbing your toe as you go by something, those things may not be big, huge things. They may not test your faith in a really major way, but do they give you a chance to choose by faith to respond in a Christ-like manner? Then they are being used by God, even if in a little way, to make you more like Christ. Ongoing trials. People Sometimes it's easy to respond the right way the first time or the second time or the 10th time, but when you've gone through the same thing for 15 years in a row, sometimes you just wake up in the morning and you just think, I'm tired of this. I am just done with this. But that's the reason for that word perseverance or endurance. It's a marathon, not a sprint in the Christian life. And what happens is sometimes the trials that will make us most like Christ are the ones that we have to keep going and going and going. Reminds me of the place in Romans 4 where Abraham, it says, remember he was promised a son, and then remember he had to wait years and years and years and years and years for that promise to come through. It says that as he went on, he grew strong in faith. Now, usually with me, I start strong in faith and then my faith fades. But Abraham, because it was something God was doing in him, grew stronger in faith as time went by. And that's something that God can be doing in us through ongoing trials. Does it count trials that are my fault? The good news is it does. Matter of fact, it's a good thing because probably most of our trials are partly our fault. If I'm struggling with financial struggles and the reason is that I spent all my money foolishly and I'm way in debt, is that trial something I can take joy in? Of course it is. God will still use the consequences of my own foolish decisions to teach me to be more like Christ. Does facing that financial struggle push me to have to trust in God and be able to have a Christ-like response? It does. Then it counts. If I'm struggling because I'm divorced, and the reason I'm divorced perhaps is my own fault. I was unfaithful, or I did something else, and now I'm lonely. That loneliness counts. The fact that somebody says, "Well, it's partly your fault." Well, almost everything is partly our fault, but it doesn't matter anyway. God still uses it, and He still uses it for good in our lives. And we don't have to say the trial is good, but we can rejoice in the good that God is doing. So even things that are my own fault count. Temptations count as trials. The Greek word for temptation is the exact same word as the Greek word for trial. The only real difference between a temptation and trial is who's behind it and how you think about it. The same situation can be a temptation from Satan's point of view and a trial from God's. In other words, Satan uses hard circumstances in our lives to tempt us away, to try to get us to choose against Christ-like behavior and Christ-like responses. But God uses those same circumstances, but as a trial, to test our faith to get us to choose the right thing. So temptations are themselves trials. Sometimes, if you're an alcoholic and you've been sober for a while now, and you're going through a day where you're just craving alcohol, that craving is a trial. That counts. You can count it all joy because it's pushing you to trust God to have a Christ-like response. If you're a worrier, if you're a very anxious person, and you think, well, I just should stop worrying. Well, that may be fine, but the very fact that you're assailed with emotions of worry, that your feelings keep attacking you and trying to take away your peace, that's the trial. That's the thing God is using to test your faith. So as you face chronic worry, that counts. You get to say, God is using my battle with chronic worry to teach me to be more like Christ. Internal trials, just as well as external ones, count. Sometimes I've been in the middle of a trial praying about God taking a circumstance away, and He said, it's as though He's pointed out to me, Kevin, your struggle is not with the circumstance. Your struggle is with your own internal response to the circumstance. The fact that you're angry about it, or the fact that you're worried about it, or whatever else. That temptation itself, that internal response itself, may be the trial that is pushing me to have to trust God. And in all this, of course, it means that even trials that are unique to me, some of you, probably every one of you, have things that are hard for you that nobody else would find hard. Nobody else would understand at all. There's certain things for me that if I have to confront somebody who's in authority over me, it's very, very difficult for me to do. It can really dominate my whole week if I have to do that later in the week. That may be hard for me in a way that it isn't for anybody else. I know people who it's difficult for them to be very extroverted. If they have to go to a large meeting, everybody else is excited about it, and they're thinking, oh, this is going to be so difficult. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person who really thrives on crowds, and the quarantine has been very difficult for you, You may have friends and other people you know who don't understand why it's difficult, but it doesn't matter. God understands, and He's using it. If He's using it to test your faith and to push you to choose between Christ-like responses and not so Christ-like responses, then it counts. So that's my message for today. Think about the different kinds of trials in your life, big and ongoing and tragic, or little inconveniences, things that surprise you, things that you were expecting, things that you weren't, the things you're tempted by, the consequences of your own past actions that you're working through, the things that are hard only for you. Doesn't matter. Think about the trials and ask God, how can I see this as an invitation to joy? How can I see this as the opportunity to take one step forward to being more like Jesus in my life? So that's my challenge to you and my encouragement to you. We'll talk a lot more about the details of these passages in the next few weeks. Thanks.